Welcome classic rock fans to another one of my worst to best ranking videos, and today we're looking at the wonderful albums of David Bowie. I will be looking at all 25 studio albums that David Bowie has put out. Yes, you heard me, 25, so that means I will not be including the soundtracks that he was involved with, nor will I be looking at the Tin Machine project. If you're new to this channel, I urge you to click like, subscribe and check that bell so you get notified of any future uploads. And for ways you can support me and the work done here at Classic Album Review, do check out some of the links below this video. There is also the link to the Facebook page there if you want to head over to that. So, David Bowie, once described by Rolling Stone magazine as rock and roll's consummate quick change artist. And there's no doubt about it, some of those alter egos he's explored have been exquisite examples of pop art theatre. Oscar Wilde famously said that all art is at once surface and symbol. And there's no doubt about it that Bowie is mindful of the potency of both, and never more so than in the tones and images explored in his music. Anyway, enough of this flim-flam, let's step into the labyrinth and see which album features at the bottom of my list. Number 25 is Never Let Me Down from 1987. Many argue this is Bowie's worst record, and I have to concur. I generally find it very difficult to find something to latch onto and enjoy about this album. It's an album that's painfully mired in all those 1980s production affectations and horrible musical tropes that very much defined the decade. Bowie is a real innovator. He transcends trends. Many argue that he's the inventor of postmodern rock and roll. But even he said of this album in an interview for Q magazine in 1989 that he felt that the music on this record got simmered down to product level. He goes on, of course, to opine that the demos were actually much, much better. It's no wonder he goes on to form Tin Machine as a back-to-basics approach to making music. Peter Frampton, of course, plays on this album, but it doesn't really help. Number 24 is Tonight from 1984. 1983's Let's Dance was an enormous success for Bowie, and there was perhaps a feeling that he needed to capitalise on that success and perhaps draw from that well of heavily stylised pop once more. Bowie has gone on record to describe himself as feeling creatively bankrupt during this period. I think that's perhaps emblematic on this album of the number of covers that appears on it. Perhaps reminiscent a little bit of Pinups, but without the quirkiness or charm. It even includes a take on the Beach Boys' God Only Knows, a song that should never be covered by anybody in my opinion. This album followed hard upon the conclusion of the Serious Moonlight tour, and maybe Bowie was feeling tired or bereft of ideas. Although it does contain Blue Jean, which is a wonderful song, and also Loving the Alien, which is another favourite of mine. Number 23 is Pinups from 1973. This is Bowie's very own retro bagatelle, if you like. It's one that's highly regarded by a lot of the Bowie faithful, but it's an album that perplexes me. I'll be honest with you, I don't generally like covers, not even, perhaps you could argue, interpretations. But it seems strange to me that, considering in the wake of the brilliant and genre-defining Ziggy Stardust and Aladdin Sane, he would then choose to do an album of covers of 1960s chart toppers. It's not a terrible album, of course. It's historically significant, as I believe it's the last album that the Spiders from Mars actually play on after, of course, that famous retirement speech that Bowie gives on stage. I think Trevor Bolder was retained simply because Bowie's attempts to get Jack Bruce were not successful. Number 22 is Hours from 1999. This is a rather languid and plaintive offering from Bowie, a wonderful precursor to all those pre-millennial jitters that regaled us with stories of aeroplanes plummeting from the sky, of course. Nevertheless, this album plays out like a slow exhalation, perhaps a step away from those abrasive textures that were explored in albums like Outside and Earthling. Thursday's Child is a real standout track for me and very much sets the stall out for this record. A record that does produce some fine music, described by Rolling Stone as nakedly emotive. However, I feel the title of Hours is appropriate here because it's a laborious affair, and he does sound rather weary on this one, perhaps in keeping with the picture on the cover, which is excellent, by the way. Ultimate Classic Rock described this album as it floats in a haze of moody melancholy that only occasionally wanders into an interesting melody. Ouch. Number 21 is Reality from 2003. Bowie once more teams up with producer Tony Visconti for this one. It's been an album that's been described by many critics as being similar to Heroes and Scary Monsters Super Creeps, although I would argue it lacks that explorative inventiveness of the former and the icy detachment of the latter. Although that being said, it does boast a collection of memorable songs. Memorable songs combined with hard-edged dynamics on tracks like Looking for Water, and perhaps less assuming on the very jazz-tinged Bring Me the Disco King. All 11 songs, of course, cluster together to thematically explore the idea of what is reality, an idea that has kept the beard strokers busy for years. It addresses the idea of reality being unknowable and a bit slippery, a very postmodern drum to be beating here, and how very prophetic really now that we live in the age of fake news and social media. Bowie himself said, "I feel like reality has become an abstract for so many people over the last 20 years. Things that they regarded as truths seem to have just melted away." Overall, it's a promising concept that for me doesn't really bear that much fruit, although there is a wonderful George Harrison cover on this one. Number 20 is David Bowie from 1967. This to me is a charming period piece, famously released at the same time as the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper, the album of course that eclipses everything. It's a collection of numbers that's emblematic of that mid-60s trend for rather quirky pop with baroque sensibilities, not to mention the very Tommy Steele-like cover portrait. It certainly attempts to mine that whimsical pop aesthetic that established by bands like the Kinks and the Small Faces, but it just lacks it doesn't possess the vision, the energy or the wit of either. There are some charming flourishes on this one. There's tracks like Rubber Band, There Is a Happy Land, and Please Mr. Gravedigger is absolutely wonderful. A broody lament for a murdered little girl, and Uncle Arthur is another one very reminiscent of those fantastic observational vignettes that Ray Davies was churning out at the time. This album feels like a sampler for all the stuff the 19-year-old Bowie was interested in at the time, from music hall to British pop to the works of Anthony Newley, all referenced on this one. A lot of Bowie aficionados will rake over the coals of this one to look for embers of the brilliance to come. For me, this is a charming piece, but one quite rightly eclipsed by what comes afterwards. Number 19 is Earthling from 1997. This is Bowie's first self-produced LP since Diamond Dogs, if I'm not mistaken, and it employs the fascinating vernacular of some of the most contemporary music of the time. Bowie, in fact, describes it as a kind of hybridization of sound, with its loud industrial power riffs and somewhat electronically squeezed vocals. One can certainly detect the influence of Trent Reznor on this one. Bowie told the Seattle Times that it was an effort to produce some really dynamic, aggressive sounding material, and one can detect the influence of bands like Prodigy and Underworld within the fabric of this record. It's a gorgeous wash of sound, described by Bowie as a textual diary of the last few years of the millennium. However, this is not the first time that Bowie has felt the need to incorporate the specific sounds from a genre. He has, of course, described himself as a synthesist, if I can just about say that, and never more apparent, of course, than his 1975 album Young Americans. Number 18 is Black Tie, White Noise from 1993, an album that seems to be quite consistently crapped upon by critics and fans alike. I rather like it, though. I love the way it starts with that arresting carillon of bells that opens the album. It immediately suggests that we're in for something special on this one. Bowie fuses urban styles with a smidgen of fierce funk jazz that wouldn't be out of place on Bitches Brew. Much credit has to go to co-producer Nile Rodgers, of course, who previously worked on Let's Dance. Bowie famously told NME that this album was the successor to Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. It certainly has that paranoid edge, and there's a chilliness, like a patient etherized upon a table, as the famous line from the T.S. Eliot poem goes. I love this phase of Bowie's career. It's riveting, dense and jagged. He's heralding a new fusion of sound, I think, from that opening peal to the paranoid jumble that is Jump They Say. There are resonances, of course, of his late 80s, more commercial stuff, as well as some of that experimental music he was producing in the late 70s. He never loses sight of that stuttering affirmation changes, which has very much been Bowie's manifesto since the get-go. In an interview for Uncut Magazine in 1999, he said, I personally think my work in the 90s has been the best I could possibly do. It's proved to have a lot of life, and it's got some strong devotees. I must admit I'm inclined to agree with him. I think later on these albums will be reassessed, and reassessed favourably. Mick Ronson plays on this one, referencing the past while looking resolutely beyond it. It's an album that has a restless quality to it. We get state-of-the-art dance club techno, as well as some really nice splashy flourishes from avant-garde jazz trumpeter Lester Bowie. I must admit I also find the Morrissey cover on this one quite interesting. Overall, an interesting album. Number 17 is Heathen from 2002. This is a real standout album for this period of Bowie's career. It's perhaps the least affected album he's done in a decade. You know, it stands favourably against that the operatic grunge of Outside and that aquatic entanglement of textures that's explored on Earthling. It certainly won't please those that are looking for the next Ziggy, but it contains some really interesting covers. For example, I love his take on the Pixies' Cactus, Neil Young's I've Been Waiting For You, and the legendary Stardust Cowboys' I Took a Trip on a Gemini Spaceship. It gives it that cosmic vibe and a bit of laid-back electro-pop fun. Other tracks worth noting on this one, of course, are Slow Burn, which is an interesting piece and vaguely elicits a 60s pop undercurrent, no doubt aided by the fact Pete Townsend plays on this one, adding his customary scattershot guitar to the proceedings. Other interesting numbers are I Would Be Your Slave, which is a series of electronic pulses intermingled with a metronomic drum pattern over overlaid strings. It's not up there with his best 70s work, of course, which really embodied a spirit of artistic upheaval and flair. But of course those albums were produced in a very different time. If I may quote The Guardian, those are records made by decadent gay saxophone playing coke-headed alien Pierrot with an interest in fascism and the occult. High praise indeed. Number 16 is Black Star from 2016. There was a bit of a media and critical furore surrounding this album when it came out. No doubt necessitated by the tragic death of David Bowie shortly thereafter at the age of 69, I believe, which obviously gives the album and its title an added poignancy. The music is an eclectic mix of scrunching industrial rock, balladeering, folksy type airy pop, and of course even some more urban influences, described aptly by NME as busy, bewildering, and occasionally beautiful. Black Star has a gothic grandeur to it, a dark elegance, and beautifully employs an array of narrative voices. I love Lazarus with its life-imbuing biblical resonances, sung of course from the perspective of Newton, the homesick alien resurrected. See what I did there? From the man who fell to earth. It's a remarkable and dense work. We get references to Norse history, Jacobean drama of course with the John Ford play, as well as militaristic tattoos on Girl Loves Me. It's an album that's definitely going to keep the beard strokers and Bowieologists busy for the foreseeable. One thing we can certainly all agree on is that this is an intriguing album. Number 15 is The Next Day from 2013. This is an extraordinary album that very much dips its toe into the past, Bowie's own past, with its smattering of sonic references, described by one critic as well-manicured nostalgia. And there's lots of little phrasings that we find on Bowie's earlier works. For example, the sped-up vocal effect on If You Can See Me is found on 1970s After All. The drum beat introduction to 5 Years actually closes You Feel So Lonely You Could Die. It feels at times like a well-thumbed exploration of Bowian motifs. I love the protagonist on Love Is Lost, it very much recalling the cocaine emaciated Thin White Duke. And there's even suggestions that stars themselves could be aliens. This whole album feels like a warm bath of sonic souvenirs from Bowie's own discography. Producer Tony Visconti says this album's a lot in common with Lodger, and he has a point. I mean, Bowie's really experiments with his voice on this one, from the rather disconcerting nasally whine of the title track, as well as a rather twisted baritone lowing. Sounds as if he's trying to do a stars in their eyes type of thing as Scott Walker or Bill Medley. One thing for sure is it's certainly a very melodic album. It's a superb album, and it has to be said that the track I'd Rather Be High is utterly beautiful. Number 14 is Space Oddity from 1969. This eclectic and kaleidoscopic sophomore album very much reflects the textures and tones of the late 60s, whilst perhaps anticipating the best work of the 1970s. NME has quite rightly said that this album has one foot in 1967 and one foot in 1972. It comes across as not so much chameleonic but indecisive, but this is very apparent in newer artists who tend to draw upon lots of influences while they're finding their own sound and own voice. In fact, the album is even named after a Stanley Kubrick movie. This album represents the ever-morphing musical refraction that is David Bowie. We get, for example, poetic yearning in Letter to Hermione, glimpses of blues, of course, in the wonderful Unwashed and Somewhat Slightly Dazed, not to mention a smidgen of Dylan, his bobness in God Knows I'm Good. And of course, Signet Committee very much comes across as a homage to Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. To To quote the BBC, this album shows not so much Bowie casting his own image, but very much in the shadow of others. It's a cut above the debut album, of course. The debut album sees Bowie fancying himself as an Anthony Newley, theatrically tinged raconteur musical dandy. And this one does, of course, contain the wonderful single Space Oddity, with its wonderful eerie use of the stylophone and organ, which gives it another worldly feel, which is probably the point, I guess. This song was great because it very much seized the zeitgeist of a populace, a space-crazed populace in the wake of the lunar landings. So it introduces us to the character of Major Tom before he was a junkie. Now, I say that because some critics at the time argued that this song was in fact a metaphor for taking heroin. I must admit I love Natalie Merchant's version of this number as well. Number 13 is Outside from 1995. This is another wonderful collaboration with the conceptualist Brian Eno. It was subtitled The Nathan Adler Diaries, a Hypercycle. And you could argue this is perhaps a sequel to Diamond Dogs. In fact, I think Bowie has said as much. The narrative thread of this album is interesting as well. It's a kind of an end of millennial thing. It's one of Bowie's bleak futurescapes. And the setting is eerie and atmospheric, very much evoking the tones and atmospheres of the Berlin trilogy. He even employs the cut and paste patchwork quilt approach to lyric writing on this one. The music is a potent blend of garage riffs, the avant-garde, and those wonderful melodramatic tones that provided by Brian Eno. Interestingly, Mike Garson tickles the ivories on this one, which gives it some nice jazz runs and little musical motifs reminiscent of some of his earlier albums. And Bowie's voice is fascinating on this one, that soulful quiver of the maturing tenor that he has. And his voice is affected by synthetic processing, which just means it blends perfectly with those Eno-esque apocalyptic soundscapes. I love the narration used on this one, with Bowie's Cockney inflections very much reflecting some of his earlier albums that plug the songs. It does a lot to alleviate the abrasiveness and harshness of some of the edges of the music. Bowie is a compelling artist to listen to, whether he's the white-souled troubadour or intergalactic impresario, or in this case the narrator to this Eno-fueled cyber-noir detective fable. It's all good stuff. Number 12 is Lodger from 1979. This is said to be out of the Berlin trilogy the easiest on the ear. I think more accessible is perhaps a more appropriate term here. We don't get those long instrumental pieces or eerie atmospherics on this one. Instead, we get a scattering of more conventional tones in the guise of these very concise pop songs. There are some critics that believe this detracts from the brilliance of Low and Heroes, and somehow this is album's an anemic poor relation to the other albums in the Berlin trilogy, not a sentiment that I concur with. True, I don't think it's as artsy, but it's a fine album nonetheless, and it does retain a twist of the avant-garde blended with a smidgen of pop sensibilities. It's very much experimental in its own way. Those tendencies are definitely there, just buried beneath lines of coke, I suspect. It has a potential for a strong commercial album and some great melodic hooks. It's a collection of 10 songs, all of which are about 3 to 4 minutes long. I think the best numbers on this album are Red Sails, DJ, Look Back in Anger and Boys Keep Swinging. The music critic Mike Powell describes the songs on this album as punky, dramatic and a little odd, with detours into reggae and Near Eastern tonalities. These songs are subverted and strengthened by layered, dissonant production values. I mean, Lodger may not stretch the boundaries of music in the same way that Low and Heroes does, but it's a strong album nevertheless. Number 11 is Let's Dance from 1983. Now, this is an album that a lot of people like to crap upon, but I think it's great. This was a monster when it came out, of course. This is Bowie's stylised, synthesised slice of post-disco gloss. And it blends beautifully with the emerging new romantic movement, a movement that many critics have quite rightly pointed out is one that was inspired by Bowie himself. We get that stutter shock sound of modern love, the seductively dark tones of China Girl, of course, and that colossus that was its title track, wrapped up in a kind of brittle, Bowified funk. Nile Rodgers adds a lot of the tonal qualities, the groove and swing of this record. It's an album of chilly dance music that's all beat and rhythm, and it's unashamedly commercial, of course. The Irish Times described it as an album pleading shamelessly for the love of the mass market. Nevertheless, it's a brilliant undertaking as far as I'm concerned, with Bowie's voice wrapped beautifully around those chunky guitar riffs. On this one, of course, we get China Girl, the song co-written with Iggy Pop, which featured on Iggy Pop's 1977 album The Idiot. an album that Ian Curtis was listening to when he tragically hanged himself. Other less well-known numbers on this, of course, are Cat People, Criminal World and Ricochet. I mean, some critics have argued that I think Ricochet bears some similarities in terms of its phrasings with David Byrne and Brian Eno's collaboration of My Life in a Bush of Ghosts. I'm not so sure about that one, though. Perhaps these songs are not as well known, but they all contribute to the rich tapestry of sound that makes up this record. A record of catchy, accessible pop songs, and that's not a criticism at all. They are ingeniously constructed and distinctively Bowie. For an artist that has so consistently embraced existential neuroticism, this album feels like a very confident slab of chart-bothering vinyl. I can see why this would be quite high on anybody's list. And as a Brucey bonus, it contains the wonderful guitar work of Stevie Ray Vaughan. Number 10 is Young Americans from 1975. Bowie retires Ziggy and moves away from those dark conceptual odes to Orwell's 1984 to reinvent himself as a soul man, even employing the young singer Luther Vandross to provide backing vocals. The radio hits Young Americans and Fame introduced Bowie to a whole new audience, an audience attracted to that blue-eyed, limber-hipped sound of his, especially after those dark, dystopian shades of Diamond Dogs. Of course, many argue the writing was on the wall. There were a lot of soul classics that started to become immersed within the set list of the 1974 tour. In fact, the tour was eventually dubbed the Philly Dogs Tour. The music on Young Americans is played by a lot of session musicians, which creates a kind of a detached appropriation of the Philly sound. But it's this detachment that sells this record for me, that adds something very much to the vibe and sound of it. Described by one critic as plastic robotic soul. And nevertheless, it still proves to be very influential. Of course, Fame is one of the best known songs on this album, which according to Nicholas Pegg communicates Bowie's and Lennon's dissatisfaction with the money-grabbing manager's mindless adulation, unwanted entourages and hollow vacuity of the limousine lifestyle. And of course, James Brown pays Bowie the ultimate tribute, I think, as he incorporates Fame in his number Hot, I Need to Be Loved, 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 which is just a great number in itself. Of course, this album moves away from the conceptual and theatrical flourishes of Diamond Dogs and Ziggy Stardust, nor does it contain the wide-eyed adventurous flush of Humpty Doory or the poise of Station to Station. However, nevertheless, it does demonstrate to me how unpredictable an artist David Bowie is. Number 9 is The Man Who Sold the World from 1971, 1971 being its UK issue date, of course. The Man Who Sold the World is considered by many to be where it all kicks off in terms of Bowie's best work. It also saw that famous dress sleeve. If you have a copy of that famous dress sleeve, it's worth a fortune, by the way. I mean, Bowie told Rolling Stone magazine at the time that he didn't want to be thought of as mediocre. Well, there was certainly no chance of that. Musically, it's a combination of blues, rock, psychedelia, folk. It's a bit of a mishmash, really, but it's the band's performance. That's what really matters here. It gives this music its unsettling edge. It's an album that very much showcases the experimental fervour of Bowie's classic period, and it employs an unusual plethora of music and lyrics to embody themes of alienation and dizzying disorientation. And the lyrics, of course, are dark, and they explore themes like religion, war and technology. And these paranoid dark tales perfectly complement Ronson's uncompromising riffing. In fact, it's Ronson's guitar that really gives this album its snarl. Another interesting factor of it is the way Bowie's voice sounds as well. We have to doff our caps to Tony Visconti for this, but it's phased, sounding almost metallic in some places, beautifully melding with the very jagged and frayed feel of the music. As an album, it's not as warm as Hunky Dory. In fact, it does sound rather odd. In fact, AllMusic goes on to say, the mix is off-centre with the fuzz bass dominating the compressed, razor-thin guitars and Bowie's strangled, affected voice. The Width of a Circle has a hallucinatory feel to it. It's one of my favourites on this album. And She Shook Me Cold contains certain psychosexual undertones that will keep us busy for the weekend. Lines like, she sucked my dormant will. Let's not forget the title track, of course, which was reintroduced to a whole new generation of music lovers via that wonderful Unplugged album by Nirvana. Number 8 is Heroes from 1977. Heroes was the second album in the Berlin trilogy, of course, and was recorded within spitting distance of the Berlin Wall. In fact, I think the Berlin Wall very much imposes itself on the sound of this record. And that wonderful title track about two lovers on either side of the wall. It's a wonderful expression of humanity at a time when the Cold War was still raging. And, the sound of this album, I think the songs are far more realised with harder rhythms and deeper layer of tones and textures. And that's partly attributed, of course, to Robert Fripp's wonderful guitar work. His muscular licks and riffs certainly complement the overlaid electronic flourishes. There's no doubt in my mind that the instrumentals owe a huge debt to German synth pop and European experimental rock. This album, and Low, of course, was a far cry from Los Angeles and those rock and roll cliches. Los Angeles, of course, was a place that Bowie went on to describe as the most vile piss pot in the world. Well, certainly in comparison to the asceticism of Berlin, Berlin must have felt like a cleansing of the palate. Most of us enjoy the very experimental approach to making music on this album, Low, and Lodger, of course, with its stream of consciousness approach to lyric writing, which very much touches upon the personal issues in Bowie's life at that time. And many argue, of course, that Beauty and the Beast is a kind of a Bowie apology for his coke-fueled forays into fascism. The sound on this album is shadowy and abstract, influenced perhaps by German expressionism, emerges such themes as death, dreams, alienation and the intangible. But it's also, of course, defined by the synth wizardry of Brian Eno and those metallic crunching riffs of Robert Fripp, whose soloing, I think, was very much made up on the spot. And that guitar sound beautifully complements Bowie's bleating saxophone and Brian Eno's storm cloud of electronic noodling. It's certainly a challenging album, but like most Bowie albums, it's one that just gets better and better every time you listen to it. Number 7 is Diamond Dogs from 1974. Bowie wanted to produce an album based on the concept of Orwell's 1984, but the writer's estate just wouldn't allow it. Instead, we get this futuristic sprawl based on the writings of William S. Burroughs, I believe. It certainly forms one of Bowie's future nightmares, so to speak, and many see it as a valediction, a waving goodbye to the glam years. It's an absolutely marvellous album, despite being described as semi-amateurish by NME. It exposes the discomfort and despair of urban existence, causing many to describe this album as proto-punk. One thing it certainly does do is it undermines that hippie idealism or that hippie utopia in shimmering shards of pansexual posturing and sci-fi futuristic dystopian fantasy. The concept is based on Halloween Jack, who is a real cool cat who has to put up with the travails and problems and life in Hunger City, of course, a place where jackals feast on corpses. As I said, it's certainly an album that is earmarks a new direction for Bowie, who starts to abandon glam, I think, and quite rightly so, because genres often transmogrify horribly into self-parody at some point. The music critic C.M. Crockford says this album it's a goofy, abrasive place where punk and art rock meet, dance a little and depart. Despite being a bit of a hodgepodge, I really think this is a marvellous album. It's almost has a Dickensian feel at times, with the peopleoids trying to survive in Hunger City. It definitely portrays a no-future bleakness long before Johnny Rotten snarls his way to the front of the stage. Number 6 is The Lad Insane from 1973. Bowie labelled this album Ziggy Goes to America. It was very much written on the US tour, giving it a very transatlantic feel. Bowie himself said it was a depiction of rock and roll America. What was really interesting about this album is Bowie was certainly enjoying playing the music on stage, but he really did not like the logistics of touring. He felt he was leading a very schizophrenic existence, which is beautifully portrayed in the visual metaphor of the front cover. And that angst is beautifully represented in Bowie's voice, of course, as he floats between bizarre lounge jazz flourishes and some hard rock vibes as well. With this album, there was a moving away from the more sci-fi elements to critique what one critic has described as the detached chic of London and New York hipsters. This, of course, is demonstrated in songs like Watch That Man Cracked Actor and Jean Genie. There's a wonderful balance struck on this one between the avant-garde, the artsy, and the high camp elements of his Ziggy alter ego. This album, of course, was written on the hoof. It was written on the US tour, as I've said, but this necessitates a more frantic pace for songwriting and affects the overall sound of this album. The album becomes a perfect platform from which Bowie can critique stardom, the cons of touring, urban decay, drugs, sex, violence, and death. It all adds to the stew that is this record. And the songs are intriguing on this album as well. I mean, the title track, it alternates between spacey avant-garde piano flourishes and the more abrasive choruses with a distinctly psychedelic vibe. Driving Saturday, I think, is fascinating as well. It's got a doo-wop feel. Portrays that post-apocalyptic world where pornography becomes cinematic self-instruction manuals. And Panic in Detroit is a wonderful one as well, based on Iggy Pop's descriptions of the 1967 Detroit riots. But one of my favourites on this album is the burlesque twists and tones of time. The writer Samuel Butler said time is the only true purgatory, and that certainly comes across in this number. There's no doubt Bowie and producer Ken Scott were looking for a harder sound for this record, and there's so many elements on it that make it a very eclectic sounding album. It's certainly a rich palette and a wonderful record to boot. Number 5 is Station to Station from 1976. This is a transitional album that sees Bowie morphing from Soul Man into Thin White Duke. It creates its own distinctive style, no doubt defined by Bowie's coke-fueled paranoia. Bowie says he has no memory of making this album, which is rather interesting, I think, but it certainly has a very cold and icy feel to it, and wonderful crooning on Wild as the Wind, a song I think that was made famous by Nina Simone, if I'm not mistaken, as well as the disco stylings of Golden Years. This is not an easy album to get into at first, I think, but its very clinical sound and icy structures was hugely influential on the post-punk and New Romantics. This album in some respects continues with that funk and soul sound of Young Americans, whilst toying with more European textures like krautrock, for example. And it provides a wonderful platform from which Bowie can launch his musings on the occult, mythology, Aleister Crowley and Friedrich Nietzsche, or Nietzsche as some people say. I love the apocrypha and dark tales that surrounds the recording of this album, from blizzards of cocaine to Nazi memorabilia and even a seance, I believe. In fact, it was at this point that I think Bowie tells NME that Britain needs a fascist leader. The mythos is very much part of the identity of this album, an album that shudders with a glittering and malevolent appeal. But I particularly like the opener on this one, that sound of the train moving between the two speakers before we get the feedback, and the band come in absolutely beautifully, before Bowie proclaims the return of the Thin White Duke throwing darts in lovers' eyes. I love the identity of the Thin White Duke. It's almost a pantomimic representation of evil, all waistcoated and crooning in a very European style, a far cry from that Philly soul of the previous album. I love the intricate complexity of what's been expressed between the artifice and rage of the music on this album. It's a compelling listen. It's certainly an album that's, I think, shrouded in mystery. A point picked up by The Guardian, if I may quote: "The cocaine had one welcome side effect. The fact that Bowie doesn't remember making it means it will never be demystified, and the Duke's corrupt glamour will therefore never fade." Number 4 is Hunky Dory from 1972. After the dark tones that were explored on The Wonderful, The Man Who Sold the World, Hunky Dory seems to almost revisit the very essence of the album that preceded that, with songs like A Song for Bob Dylan and Quicksand, of course. One could be forgiven perhaps for thinking that Bowie had abandoned those abrasive textures, and how wrong would we be? Hunky Dory is an odd mix. It's an array of pop patterns unified by Bowie's innate sense of style and vision. We are presented with an engaging melange of numbers touching upon somewhat bizarre topics. The stripped back sound of this one paradoxically makes it more lush, if that makes sense. For example, as listeners we bask in the broader resonances of the piano and the guitars, and of course Bowie's vocalizations and harmonies. Unlike its predecessor, of course, it's an album that accentuates the scope and breadth of Bowie's ambitions. Even Bowie himself went on to say that this was a pivotal album for him. On this one, of course, we get that stuttering manifesto changes and the soul-nourishing, some might argue, Sinatra parody that is Life on Mars. Of course, it's Rick Wakeman as a session player that adds certain whimsical and pastoral qualities to the sound of this one. This album is a real step forward for Bowie, who displays a much more pronounced sense of melody and style, which allows him to interpret those popular tropes in contemporary music, earning him that epithet of inventor of postmodern rock and roll. The songs for this album were written during Bowie's first visit to America, and Bowie acknowledges that this largely inspires the tones and sounds on this album. And there's some really interesting pen tributes on this one as well, from Bob Dylan, the aforementioned Andy Warhol, and of course Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground. And one can detect the influence of Dylan in Bowie's songwriting here as his lyrics become increasingly surreal. Mickey Mouse has grown up a cow, for example. and certainly Changes, I think, throws down the gauntlet for those already established rock acts. This album could easily be at the top of anyone's list. It didn't do particularly well when it came out, but then shot up the charts, hanging on tightly to the coattails of Ziggy Stardust. Biographer Nicholas Pegg writes about the importance of this album and how it signposts the brilliance that was to come. He says, "Humpty Doory stands at the first great crossroads in Bowie's career. It was his last album until Low, to be presented purely as a sonic artifact rather than a vehicle for the dramatic visual element with which he was soon to make his name as a performer." Number 3 is Ziggy Stardust from 1972. It's very difficult to find something new to say about this wonderful, wonderful album, arguably Bowie's best, but there's no doubt most critics agree that there is a maturing in style from Humpty Doory. Of course, on this one we get the story of the alien who offers salvation, ultimately destroying himself. These songs represent the pinnacle of what would become glam rock in their inventiveness, structure and sound. I imagine they were a burst of light that illuminated a rather bleak landscape, a landscape at the time defined by the 3-day week, impending economic recession. They must have felt like a breath of fresh air. This album for me is the bastard progeny of T-Rex and Stanley Kubrick and builds upon those dark tonal qualities explored on the Man Who Sold the World. The idea of this androgynous alien rock star is beautifully enwrapped in Bowie's own torn and paranoid musings. Lyrics that conjure up a decadent and decaying future. This seems to be a motif that's continuously explored in Bowie's work. We can see how perhaps the concept of 1984 appealed to him. The music on this album combines glitzy, crunching riffs, melodic hooks, as well as a sense of camp melodrama. And of course, a lot of credit has to go to Mick Ronson. I mean, it's his guitar work on this album that really gives this record its bite and snarl, and very much complements the staged drama of the piece. Whether or not Ziggy is actually Iggy or Vince Taylor, or loosely based on Lou Reed, or perhaps even Bowie's own inner alien, it's nevertheless a marvellous story and album. Number 2 is Low from 1977. This is a strange record, there's no doubt about that. Ultimate Classic Rock says it creates a universe you can inhabit. And of course, after the excesses of the LA years, Bowie says he had no statement to make on this album. But for me, it's so beautiful and fragile in its tonal qualities. We get this, the first side is a collection of songs that almost feels like an array of demos to me. I have to say it's gorgeously unsatisfying, and that's before we're taking on this strange journey through an ambient and electronic landscape with no doubt Brian Eno acting as our guide here. After Station to Station, the writing in terms of Bowie's artistic direction was very much written on the wall, particularly the one that divides East and West. And he definitely explores more European expressionism and tones on this one. Part of this album was actually recorded in France. It was recorded at the Chateau de Reville, which was famous for the Jethro Tull Chateau disaster tapes. Elton John's Honky Chateau, and I believe also Cat Stevens and Pink Floyd recorded there. Low is a dense and challenging album, defined of course by Eno's dissonant synthesizers and ambient explorations. On the first half of this album, the synths drone away to the jagged strumming and riffs of the guitars. One critic has described this album as having a menacing robotic pulse. And Bowie's vocals are very odd as well. They're either too low in the mix or unnaturally layered, but there's no doubt that he worked very well with Brian Eno. One critic has written, of course, that Eno functioned as a conduit for Bowie's ideas. Of course, this is the album that contains Sound and Vision with that gorgeous guitar motif, and Be My Wife, of course, which is the highlight on an album of highlights. And number 1 is Scary Monsters from 1980, or Scary Monsters and Super Creeps if you like. This album strikes a perfect balance between the music and the melody of his earlier albums while still containing the artistic fervour of the Berlin trilogy. It's also a critique of contemporary trends, and what Bowie must have seen is the artistic vacuity of what he perceives as the rush towards spectacle and homage that descends horribly into hyperbole and parody. Tony Visconti, the co-producer on this album, said that Bowie wanted an album that was less experimental and more concerned with achieving a commercially viable sound. He certainly does that on this. In fact, Melody Maker describes this as an eerily impressive stride into the 80s. But there is a distinctive icy bleakness to this album as Bowie surveys the world around him and the offerings of a new generation of musicians. This irredeemable depiction of the political and musical landscape gives this album its hue, with the washed out qualities of the album art very much acting as its pall. On this one, Bowie surveys a whole new generation of clones that takes his very stylised postures of the past and turns it into the new romantic dogma of the present. It's almost as if the only sane recourse for Bowie is to kind of lampoon his own contributions in this very ironic display of self-refraction. As Rolling Stone has pointed out, it must have very much felt like Prometheus aghast at what the mortals have made of his gift. Some critics have made a compelling case for this being the fourth album in the Berlin trilogy. How you can have a fourth album in a trilogy is beyond me, plus also the fact that this album was actually recorded in London and New York. One thing that can be said about this record, it demonstrates that Bowie achieves one thing a lot of his 70s peers could not, and that is stay relevant after the punk revolution. These songs could be described as anti-romantic or bereft even. There's a wonderful line in the title track, I love that little girl and I love her to the day she dies. He just sings it with such detached chilliness, and that faux, exaggerated London accent of his it's like a grim musical parody awash with mawkish sentiment. And Ashes to Ashes as a sequel to Space Oddity almost feels like an exercise in artistic self-annulment. As fashion, of course, has the world marching on like mindless automatons. Certainly the music on this album sounds harsh and the worldview far more desperate, and of course a lot of the tonal qualities for that has to be attributed to Robert Fripp's fantastic guitar work. This is a wonderful piece of work. It's dry, ironic, self-deprecating, with Bowie refusing to bask in the adulation from his imitators. It's a powerful depiction of a postmodern hell of his own making. What a statement to welcome in a new decade. Anyway, that concludes my trek through Bowie's discography. I'd like to say thank you to David Anderson for allowing me to use the wonderful caricature of David Bowie in my thumbnail. And if you haven't already done so, please do click like, subscribe and check that bell so you get notified of any future uploads. And if you appreciate the work that goes into these reviews and listing videos rankings, do take a moment to check some of the links below this video for ways you can support me and the work done here at Classic Album Review. It's always much appreciated. So I'd like to end by saying thank you all very much for being part of this classic rock family. Do stay safe in these rather challenging and difficult times. More importantly, please do keep listening.